This short screencast gives us a way to visualize the negative consequences of an externality. To this point, we've talked about negative consequences of an externality, or positive consequences of an externality in the case of positive externalities. In theory, and we've talked about how to deal with externalities, we would want to change the quantity. We'd either want to make the equilibrium quantity be something smaller or something bigger, depending on if we wanted less or more of the product in question. We can examine graphically the effects of a negative externality of cigarettes. And again, if this was a positive externality, we would simply flip the analysis. We can examine the negative consumption externalities of cigarettes if we think about the demand curve as not just a function that describes people's willingness and ability to buy certain quantities at certain prices, but also a function of their benefit of consumption, right? So we know that people will consume a certain quantity. Every point on this curve indicates a certain quantity and price. So I'm just putting the laser pointer right there. At this price, people would consume that quantity. I'm not going to add lines to the graph because it's already plenty of lines. And at every point on the graph, people are consuming certain quantities at certain prices. Now, a rational actor, in other words, somebody who's behaving rationally, would only consume a particular quantity at a certain price if that was worth it to them. They would pay. You would not pay more than you value you would not pay a price higher than you value the quantity consumed. In other words, the price you pay for something is a pretty good indication of how much you value it or how much benefit it is to you. So each quantity consumed, each additional quantity consumed, indicates an additional level of utility. Now, that's nothing new to us. What is new is that we're going to say that the demand curve can actually be seen as a function of what we call marginal private benefit. Each unit consumed adds a little bit more benefit to all the consumers. So if this demand curve indicates all the people who smoke cigarettes, it also indicates how much value those smokers get from each additional cigarette or pack of cigarettes consumed. And we call it private because it's just the people in the market who choose willingly to be cigarette smokers. So the demand curve actually is, another way of looking at the demand curve is to say the marginal private benefit curve. Similarly, we can also say that suppliers would only supply an increased quantity of cigarettes if the price went up enough to cover the costs of producing those additional cigarettes, right? That's why the supply curve slopes up to the right. Now, the reason that we can then therefore call the supply curve the marginal private cost curve. Each step up the curve indicates the marginal private cost, the additional cost to all the suppliers of cigarettes. But we would call it private because it is affecting only the suppliers of cigarettes, not other people who are not suppliers of cigarettes. So the supply curve can also be called the marginal private cost curve. The demand curve can be called the marginal private benefit curve. Now, in the case of cigarette consumption, the negative externalities are many, but one of the main ones would be secondhand smoke. In other words, there's a benefit to all the cigarette smokers of consuming cigarettes that's indicated by this marginal private benefit curve. But at every quantity consumed, the rest of society has to deal with the additional cigarette smoke. So another way to think of it is like this. At say this, I'm just going to pick a spot here, almost at random here. At this quantity consumed, where the yellow dot is, the benefit to the smokers is something like that, somewhere around there, indicated by that price. But because the rest of society has to deal with the cigarette smoke, if we take their circumstances into account, the benefit is actually something less than. Society only values it at this price, in other words. So what we call that is the marginal, oops, wrong button. We call that the marginal social benefit. The marginal social benefit is the benefit to society of cigarettes being consumed privately in the market. In other words, all these people consume all these cigarettes, they get this much benefit from it. But really, society only benefits this much because a lot of people don't want that negative externality of secondhand cigarette smoke. Okay, so I'm going to actually erase this here if I can. to create some space. And what we now see then is that if we account for the marginal social benefit, if we account for the negative externality, we really should be at an equilibrium right here, right? The preferences of society are here. This is how much cigarette smoking society wants. This is how much cigarette smoking the cigarette smokers want. But if we take into account everybody's preferences, which is I don't want to be around secondhand cigarette smoke, that means that the marginal social benefit curve would be somewhere here. The socially optimal output of cigarettes then would be somewhere here. We call that quantity including the externality, or P including the price including the externality, or we could also call it the price. Nope, that's a bad color. Let me get rid of that. Price optimal, quantity optimal. So again, to review what's happening here is that at this equilibrium, there's too much cigarette smoke, because when we account for the externalities, we see that the value of smoking cigarettes to society is something less than the private benefit. If we then fully take into account that, we see that we would have a social benefit somewhere here, which means that we would rather have that level of cigarette smoking. Now, why not just get rid of cigarettes altogether? Well, if you do, then you do take away some of the benefit that the smokers get, and smokers are people too. And in a free market society, we do like to preserve choice, but we do also want to make the smokers, these are the smokers, have to deal with some of the negative consequences here of their secondhand cigarette smoking. Now, the way we usually do that is by taxing. We would add a tax to the supply curve, and if we put the tax in the right spot, I'm just going to try to put it approximately in the right spot. If we put the tax in the right spot, you could probably see pretty quickly that we are going to end up bringing about the optimal quantity at the optimal quantity of cigarettes. In other words, by taxing the suppliers, we'll get fewer cigarettes consumed, and we'll actually get the socially optimal point of cigarettes consumed. So it gets a little complicated, but this is a way we can visualize what's going on.